Good morning. Happy Maundy Thursday. This is the day in Holy Week where we remember Jesus eating the Last Supper with the disciples, celebrating a Passover meal. So, what we're going to do today is take a few minutes to talk through some of the symbolism from Passover. Hopefully, you can enact some of these things in your meal tonight. We want to look at the symbols of a Seder, specifically what might have happened at the Passover meal with Jesus. And to grasp that, we need to start with the power of story. Not just any story, not a fairy tale, but a story of people's lives, their experience, because the Passover flows out of the captivity in Egypt where the Jews were enslaved for 400 years. And we read about the night that they were set free and the first Passover meal in Exodus 12, where God told them to sacrifice a lamb, to eat the meat of the lamb in a meal, to put the blood of the lamb on the doorposts of their houses, and to go inside. And when the angel of death came to bring judgment on Egypt, they would pass over the houses of the Israelites. And this story was told over and over every year at the Passover meal. It was a long history of celebrating God's power to free the people in bondage. And what's happening through this time, as year after year they go through these symbols in this celebration, is there's an embedding of symbols in the psyche of the people, helping them to remember the faithfulness of God at a very, very deep level. Now, we know the Last Supper with Jesus and the disciples in the upper room was a Passover meal. But the Seder, as we now know it, was formalized after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So we don't know exactly what Jesus and the disciples would have done that night. But there are some things that we do know. Just from the Old Testament guidelines that Jesus and the disciples would have followed, we do know that at this meal, candles would have been lit to symbolize the presence of God with them. We also know the meal would have included bread and bitter herbs and wine as symbolic elements. As the Seder came to be developed, they would use 4 cups of wine based on Exodus 6, 6, and 7. There are 4 I will statements. And in the playing out of the Passover Seder, they would drink a cup for each of these statements. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from slavery. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great acts of judgment. And I will make you to be my people, and I will be your God. And through this you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. So the Seder would start with the first cup, the cup of sanctification, the cup that celebrates the fact that God promised to bring them out. At some point during the meal, the leader would take a green leafy vegetable and would dip it into salt water, usually parsley. And they would say something like this: the parsley represents the branch of hyssop plant which spread the lamb's blood over the doorposts in Egypt. As it is written, and you shall take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood that's in the basin. The salt water represents the tears shed while in the bondage of slavery. Taste the tears which we shed while in Egypt. At another point, they would take the matzah, the unleavened bread. There'd be 3 pieces. And they would take the middle one out. They would break it in half. And they would hide it away in a cloth somewhere in the house. Kids would look for it later. I'll explain that in a minute. Often these 3 pieces are thought to represent God and humanity with the priest in between. We know these things would have happened because the meal was intended to teach, by symbol and interaction, a focus on God's faithfulness to bring freedom to his people. That interaction was encouraged too with the children, and they would ask 4 questions. First, they would ask, why is this night different? And they'd be answered, we must regard ourselves as if we came out of Egypt. For it is written, on that day, tell your son, I do this because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. They wanted the people, even hundreds of years later, to identify with both the slavery and the freedom from that time. Why do we eat bitter herbs tonight at this special meal? Well, because when we were in Egypt, our lives were made bitter by hard labor. And the third question, why do we eat unleavened bread at this special meal? Well, when Pharaoh let us go from Egypt, we ran so quickly that there was not enough time to let the bread rise and bake it. And then fourth question, on other nights we eat meat boiled, roasted, or stewed, but why on this night do we eat it only roasted? because on the night of the first Passover, God spared those who shed the blood of a lamb and wiped that blood on their doorposts. So after these questions and interactions, they would move to the second cup of judgment. I will deliver you. And they would do something unusual here as the leader recited the 10 plagues that came upon Egypt before the release of the Jews. They would dip their finger 10 times into the cup and taste the wine on their tongue. They would dip because the teaching was that one should never rejoice in God's judgment on another person, even on our enemies. And so then after they had remembered the judgment of God, they would finish the cup in thanksgiving to their God for liberation. The Seder would continue by taking the matzah and putting haroset on it. Now, haroset is a mixture of apple and nuts. It's a paste, and it would remind them of the brick and mortar that they used as they built all the projects in Egypt, the hard labor. And then they would take maror on the matzah, which is like horseradish. It's a bitter herb, and they would taste that, to taste the bitterness of slavery that they had while they were in Egypt. Then they would eat the full meal, including the lamb that had been sacrificed. Now, after the meal, they would grab this hidden matzah. They'd send the kids off to look for it, and someone would find it. Usually the person who found it got a prize of some sort. And remember, we said that middle piece is the priest who stands between man and God. And it's interesting when you think about that, because then they would take this middle piece that had been found, that had been wrapped away, and break it. And in this meal, Jesus says, "This is my body, which is broken for you. Take and eat." A body that would be wrapped in a cloth the next day and laid in a tomb. After that, they would drink the third cup, the cup of redemption. I will redeem you. And we know Jesus at this meal said, "This cup is a new covenant of my blood, which is poured out for many," that he would bring the redemption. And then the meal would close with the cup of praise. I will take you to me for a people. Now, what's interesting is we read in the Gospels at the end of the meal, Jesus said, "I tell you the truth, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it anew in the kingdom of God." So it seems like he leaves the meal unfinished. And it's interesting when you think about that in light of what the Gospels point to ultimately what's mentioned in Revelation 19:19 as the wedding supper of the Lamb, when we'll once again celebrate with Jesus, and he'll drink it anew in the kingdom of God. See, the Last Supper as a Passover has all these things, but we also need to realize that we live waiting for the fulfillment of the final Passover meal. In a sense, we live between the cups, waiting for the wedding feast. So tonight, as you sit down together or by yourself in your home, what are some ways that you can internalize the symbols of the Passover? Well, I'd say, first of all, make sure you eat a sit-down meal tonight. Now, I realize our routines are different and unusual now. Things have changed because of all that's going on with COVID. But take the time, even if you're by yourself, to eat a sit-down meal tonight. And incorporate one or more of the symbols from the Passover meal, whether it's lighting a candle to remember God's presence with you, whether it's the bitter herbs, breaking bread, drinking at 4 different times, 4 cups of something, or doing the interactive elements with children if you're a family. Do all these things to reflect on how Christ's coming, sacrifice, and resurrection has set you free. See, the whole purpose of this meal is to remember God's faithfulness as we live between the cups. I would even encourage you to leave a cup on the table after the meal to symbolize you're waiting for the coming wedding feast of the Lamb. And then finally, share your experience with others, either during the meal or afterward. If you are alone, call someone up and tell them what you did. Tell them about it. If you're in a group, linger at the table for a while. Reflect on what you've just done. Thanks for watching. Hope this helps you to think through a bit more of what the sacrifice of Jesus was as it relates to our freedom that was bought through the cross. God bless. Talk to you soon.